Well, let's now bring in the Worldwide Fund for Nature in South Africa on this conversation. We are now joined via Zoom by Louise Naude, who is the Senior Manager for Climate Change Portfolio with WWF South Africa, as well as a member of the Presidential Climate Commission. Well, a very good afternoon to you, and thanks so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me.
Let's start here, the importance of the summit for South Africa. Obviously, having President Cyril Ramaphosa representing us there at COP27 already indicates really the importance of it all. But let's talk really in totality about why this is essential.
So, to solve the climate crisis, and I think a very important message was there in the Secretary General's opening address. Yeah. We are dangerously close. Dangerously close. We really have to hear that, to a point of no return. So it is very important that at national and in multilateral forums like the UNFCCC as the one that's been set up to deal with this, that countries get around and get to a common direction and plan for how we're going to tackle this. It is equally important that subnational actors take action. You know, cities, provinces, businesses, and as people, you know, some of the young people in your clip were saying, also in your own lives. Yeah. Because the science tells us it's going to take everyone doing everything. Yeah. To tackle this.
I mean, I understand that leaders are expected to discuss compensating poor nations for mounting damage linked to global warming. In what way would this compensation really help? And what are we talking? Are we talking monetary compensation, and where does it land up, and what does it do? I mean, you know, it's always interesting to me when, you know, these leaders come together and they have all these wonderful conversations, but at the end of the day, does it really benefit, you know, Joe Soap? You know, what does it for?
So I think you're raising a very important conversation about, so the first thing we have to do is stop putting those emissions that are driving global warming and climate change out there. So developed countries have to, you know, the ones who are historically the most responsible for climate change must cut their emissions rapidly and drastically and, you know, in large volumes. Then all of us are having to start trying to adapt to climate changes, such as the things that are being shown on your screen there. But at the sort of the final piece of that three-step action is that there are some changes happening to which we cannot adapt. You know, some small island states, for example, the sea level rise is already eating away their countries. They can do nothing but move. Another kind of loss and damage is, you know, extreme damage to infrastructure. Yeah. And at that point, when you can't adapt, when you're just coping with the damage done to your country and to your economy, is where we're asking developed countries to step in and fund, you know, dealing with that loss and damage. Yeah. And as you say, you know, how that money is transferred and who gets to handle and allocate it is a very important question to be discussed. My own view was, you know, would be that it must go to national governments and to develop and finance institutions in the countries. Yeah. But there must be mechanisms to get it to the people on the ground who are really suffering.
Yeah. And maybe I should have started with this question then, with regards to, you know, the fact that, you know, there were a lot of implementations that, you know, and promises that have been made in the past. How concerning is it for you or to you that, you know, not much has been done in terms of implementation of some of those resolutions that were taken, let's say, COP26? And I think President Cyril Ramaphosa did allude to this, the fact that, you know, there's inaction. We talk about these things, but then there is this sort of inaction on the part of, you know, and I would say on the part of the bigger nations, because that's who really can actually put, you know, talk to action.
So I don't know, about 10 years ago or something, there was a promise of putting 100 billion a year towards developing countries to support them in their transition and in building their resilience. hardly any of that money has come forth. There is now, then at COP26, there was this big announcement about the Just Energy Transition Partnership between four governments, being the EU, France, Germany, the US, and the UK, who was specifically going to give money to South Africa to fund our just energy transition. The transition is bigger than just the energy sector, but they wanted to fund the energy transition piece. South Africa has compiled the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan, which our president and Mr. Daniel Minele presented to the commissioners, the climate change commissioners, on Friday evening. And the task team and the secretariat have calculated that over the years 2023 to 2027, we need 1.5 trillion rand to be able to make that transition happening. And these five governments have given us so far 128 billion. So you can see the vast gap between what has come forward and what is needed. The private sector is putting in, quite a lot of money to make the transition happen. There's a funding gap of 700 billion that still needs to come. So, we would be urging developed countries, those five, but others as well, to really start ramping up their financial contribution. And we've put a plan as a country, we've put a plan on the table with very many good features of how we would spend the money and what it would do, to effect our transition.
I have
important part.
I have this concern while you're talking about all these monies, and it all really does sound great. It's actually a question I posed to a UNICEF representative just an hour ago about, how high on the priority list is this for developed nations to give out all these monies, given the fact, let's just think about, what we've been dealing with, the last couple of years. It's not only an energy crisis, we're also dealing with an issue of the fact that we're coming out of a pandemic that really, knocked many countries financially. So one wonders, when they're talking about climate change, if there's any sort of seriousness when it comes to giving out these monies and making compensations, one could ask whether this is really a priority.
So that is particularly what this COP27 will test. It will test whether there is that kind of seriousness, and it will also be a test for the trust between developed and developing countries. Because unless those countries now, step seriously into the kind of promises that they have made and their duty and responsibility, this is going to just erode the trust between developing and developed countries, which really we can't afford. We need an approach that's collaborative and tackles the problem. But an interesting thing about this energy transition in South Africa is that we are very determined that it should be a just transition. So the transition is happening, whether we like it or not. And there are people in this country who want to cling to coal and other fossil fuels. And we can try to cling, but globally, the vehicle manufacturing industry is moving to electric vehicles. We better be there because auto manufacturing is a big part of our economy. The world is, despite the temporary sort of blip due to the war in Ukraine, the world is moving off coal. So we can stick our head in the sand and not do anything. But the transition will then anyway happen. So the issue about a just transition is to do it in a way that caters to South Africa's circumstances and context, that makes sure that we do it in a managed, responsible, phased approach, and that we look after the workers, the local communities, the towns, where their economies are dependent upon the coal value chains and those whole supply chains. So, when we talk about our transition in South Africa, it has to be that a transition that is just,
Yeah.
both geopolitically just, based on some of the issues you've been raising and we've been talking about, and also just in terms of, you know, looking after the people most likely to be negatively impacted.
All right,
But
Louise.
there's also another side to this transition, which, you know, everybody only wants to look at the problems of slowly getting ourselves off fossil fuels in this country. But there's also an enormous opportunity story to be told. You know, this new economy, not just in the energy sector, but in all sectors. If we start building a climate resilient and low carbon economy, there are opportunities for businesses, new business models to flourish in that new economy. So we also have to work hard on that side.
Yeah.
So this the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the investment plan that South Africa has put up, has all those kinds of dimensions in it. For example, one of the things in there is to put money into building a green hydrogen industry in South Africa, to position us to be a market leader, you know, on that product in the new global economy. So, yeah, I think there's some exciting things in that plan, and we must make sure that the money flows.
All right. So, Louise, thanks very much for giving us your time. Then Louise Naude is the Senior Manager for Climate Change Portfolio at WWF South Africa.